Welcome to the Rent to Rent Success podcast, all about creating consistent cash flow, escaping the 9-to-5, and really living life on your terms. This is the only podcast entirely dedicated to helping you achieve rent to rent success. It's our place to inspire each other to believe bigger, to be bolder, and to be game changers for good. I'm Stephanie Taylor, your guide on this exciting ride. Let's start up the engines and get ready to fly. Hello. Stephanie here, and welcome to the 14th episode of the Rent to Rent Success podcast. And today we're diving into a very controversial subject that really gets people's undergarments in a twist. What to do if you can't pay your landlord. If you're joining us for the first time, a huge welcome to you. Do go back and listen from episode 1 because each episode builds on the next to give you the full picture of rent-to-rent success. And thank you for all your reviews. Today, I want to call out Sam Lynch. Sam said, I always find their content so practical and useful, and the podcast is no exception. Their approach to property investing is unique and easily digestible. Can't wait to hear more from Stephanie and Nicky. Well, thank you, Sam, for taking the time to leave us a written review on Apple Podcasts. We're really grateful to you. And if you've been enjoying the podcast and you haven't left a review yet, please leave a review and a few words on Apple Podcasts. You know you want to. Okay, back to today's episode. We're talking about what to say if you just can't pay. Like many people with tenants right now, you might be concerned about how to manage your finances while we're in this lockdown due to coronavirus. This is for those situations where you as a renter are in a position where you can't pay your landlords. And before I go on, I just want to also refer you back to episode 13, where I talked about what to do if your tenants can't pay, because if you get that sorted out, you might not have this issue where you can't pay your landlords. So the episode about if your tenants can't pay is at renttosuccess.com/13 for the show notes, because it's episode 13. So back to today and paying your landlords. Coronavirus is causing havoc. Huge companies are not paying their rent due to coronavirus. And rent-to-rent companies will usually be small companies like us. So I've seen vicious exchanges on social media between people who say, well, guaranteed rent should mean guaranteed rent. And others who say, well, excuse me, but the government's stopping me from running my business, and this is money that I can't make back. Legally, you have an obligation under your contract to pay the guaranteed rent, the same as your tenants do, and we talked about that in episode 13. However, you can come to an agreement with your landlord. People in our Kickstarter program have negotiated different agreements, so some have managed to carry on like we have with no change to the guaranteed rent, and other people have agreed with their landlords to have a reduction in rent during the lockdown period. So if you saw episode 2 of Rent to Rent Real Talk, sorry, it's not episode 2. If you saw the episode of Rent to Rent Real Talk featuring Maria was explaining that her landlord has agreed to rent reduction. He was delighted that she contacted him and that she continued to pay the reduced amount that they'd agreed during the lockdown. So much so that he even sent her a thank you note afterwards. And Marie reflected on this and said, well, maybe he was so grateful because there were other companies who just totally stopped paying and also didn't communicate. So I'll put a link to that episode of Rent to Rent Real Talk with Maria in the show notes. And you can see the show notes at renttosuccess.com/14 for episode 14. Now, I want to talk to you about what impact coronavirus has had on our business and what we did. So the two biggest risks were non-payment of rent from the tenants and also having empty rooms. So let's talk about non-payment of rent. Well, thanks to the government's financial support, including the universal credit and furlough in particular, most tenants could pay their rent straight away. And a tiny number needed a rent payment plan to pay a lower amount initially and then make it up once their universal credit payments had come through. So, in short, really, non payment hasn't been an issue. And even though it's likely that some people who are currently on furlough will lose their jobs, the changes to universal credit mean they'll be able to claim more quickly than they could have done before. And more people will be eligible for universal credit, and universal credit rates have been increased. What this means is that most people will be able to cover their rent, even if they are laid off from their roles and made redundant. So moving on to number 2, and the second issue has been an issue for us, and that is empty rooms. Before the lockdown, we were about to move a tenant into our only empty room. That move didn't go ahead as the person was due to start a job, which then never started. And then lots of people handed in their notice due to moving home after being laid off or furloughed or told to work from home. Over a few weeks, our voids, that's the percentage of empty rooms that we have, went from nothing to 20%. So that was very uncomfortable as we guarantee the rent because we know that we can do the work. And then suddenly we can't do the work. Nothing we can do can resolve this. So we talked in episode 13 about lots of options to fill your properties with key workers and people who need emergency housing. But these options were not available to us because we had partially tenanted houses, and mainly the partial tenants or people who were in those houses were young professionals. So they didn't want to be joined by key workers and other high risk people, as you can imagine. And we chose not to go down that road. Are you ready to take the next step, but you still have so many questions unanswered? We got you. You can get your free rent-to-rent success guide at rent2rentsuccess.com/guide. That's rentsuccess.com/guide, and it'll walk you through what rent-to-rent is all about, and you'll see whether it's right for you. Okay then, now let's get back to today's show. So what did we do? We made sure that all our rooms were ready to go and that some of them were advertised on Spare Room, so that we were ready when the lockdown eased and the inquiries restarted. We also made sure our poetry game was on point. If you don't know what I mean by poetry, I explained that in episode 13, so do go and have a listen to that one. We looked at our figures and we forecast ahead, and we worked out that we could certainly weather the storm for at least 6 months, paying the full rent with up to 30% voids. It's also worth saying here that you should look at the government financial help and see whether it's relevant to you. And you can see an overview of that in the show notes for episode 13. We committed to keep paying the full rent and to reevaluate our position each month. As I say, it's really important to us to come out of this knowing that we did absolutely the best that we could do for our landlords, for our tenants, and for our business. You know, it's so easy to get drawn into the challenges when you're in a challenging situation. But when we look ahead and we can see that each deal is for 5 years, that a few tricky months is not a big deal. And we knew that with our 20% voids, we could work with that for a short time at least. However, not everyone has those cash reserves or is in the position that we're in. So some renters might have no rent coming in at all, or they might have lost their job that they would have used to subsidize the rent. So it's not a one size fits all. So our advice to you, no matter what your situation is, create a win-win. So that starts with talking to your landlord. Let's move on to that now. What to say when you can't pay. Communication with your landlords is very important, and you've got to get the message right. And I want to share with you the letter that we sent to all our landlords at the beginning of coronavirus. And these may come in useful even if you have other issues which affect your ability to pay rent, even if it's nothing to do with coronavirus. And we sent this because even though we knew we could cope for a while, we didn't know if something would be announced causing more people to hand in their notice. Nobody knew what would happen at the beginning and where we would end up. We didn't know whether we would go to 20% voids, 50% voids, or it's hard to imagine 100% voids, but we didn't know. So we wanted to start the conversation with our landlords early on so that we didn't have to hit them with anything. And we knew they would be worrying about this as well. So we just wanted to let them know what our situation was. And so this is the email that we sent. I'm just going to give you some of the headlines. So the first thing we did was acknowledge that landlords themselves would be concerned. We reminded them that we hadn't missed a payment or ever been late, and that our aim is to maintain that. We signposted that there are threats to our business operation that are outside of our control, and we won't be able to operate our business in the normal way. They would have been familiar with that, but we just wanted to explain what it actually was meaning in our business at the moment. And we pledged to stay in touch with them and let them know well in advance if there would be any issues or changes as far as our arrangements with them were concerned. And that email was well received. I think people like it when you are honest with them. And in this case, our honesty was, we're going to do our best for you. We don't know what's going to happen and if it's going to affect us in a way that we can't do what we've contracted to do with you. And if that happens, we're going to let you know well in advance. And also, we're sending this message in the context of having all of those years of equity built up with our landlords. And that's what you will have as well. You've provided that good service. You've communicated with them. You've never missed a rent payment. You've diligently managed the properties. And that means when challenging times happen like this, it's much easier to communicate with your landlords, and they understand that these are under unprecedented times and all sorts of unusual things are happening that nobody would have predicted. And they know that we are working hard to minimize the impact on all of our landlords. And, my aim is for all of our landlords and all of our tenants to think, oh, I'm so glad that I was with HMO Heaven. So to summarize here, what to do is to assess your situation with a calm head. Ensure that you've applied for the government assistance that's applicable to you. Communicate with your landlords for a win-win. And don't lose sight of the big picture. You've got 5 years of this. So with everything that you do things that you can look back on in a year and be really proud of. That might mean agreeing a rent reduction or even agreeing to return a property. What's important is that you communicate with your landlord from the intention of a win-win outcome. And also, just want to mention to you as well that we've revised our contracts to provide us with more protection should a new, quote, unprecedented crisis occur. Our solicitor has added in some new corona clauses so that if anything happens like this again in the future and our ability to operate is impacted, especially if it's long term, that we can negotiate our rent accordingly. And you'll find a link to more information about our contracts in the show notes for episode 12, which is all about rent-to-rent contracts. And that's at renttoRentSuccess.com/12 for episode 12. That's rentsuccess.com/12 for episode 12. So for more about how these things work in practice, because you might say, well, that's all very well in theory, but how does it work in practice? Join us for our live episodes of Rent to Rent Real Talk. These are conversations with real people about the reality of running a rent to rent business. And at the moment, these are happening every Wednesday at 8 p.m. in our Rent to Rent Success Secrets Facebook group. And I'll put the link to it in the show notes. It's renttoRentSuccess.com/group. Will take you right to our Facebook group. So you're here at the end, so I know you're enjoying this. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. I know that it is a little bit fiddly, so I super appreciate you doing it. Thanks for being here with me today. Until next week, have a great rest of the week. And remember, believe bigger, be bolder, be a game changer.
Thank you so much for listening. If you like the links for anything mentioned in today's episode, or if voice is not enough and you want to see us on video too, you can find all the show notes and lots more at renttorentsuccess.com. That's rent number 2, rentsuccess.com. If you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd super appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to review it in your podcast app. Remember, we'll be donating to our B1G1 charities too for each review you give. Until then, believe bigger, be bolder, be a game changer.